It's Sunday, July 13th of 1997. The morning light has just started to illuminate the scenic wilderness of Hainbach Park. A resident from Springfield, Virginia is taking a stroll through the wooded trails, surrounded by thick forest. He moves past a giant shelter of trees to reach an open area beneath the famous Springfield Railway Bridge. Summer has set in and birds are chirping, but despite the mesmerizing scenery, the man is about to stumble upon a sight that will rip away the joy and peace of the moment forever. Lying twisted and broken on the cold pavement below the railway bridge is the mangled body of a young man, his limbs unnaturally bent in horrific angles. His skin is torn, exposing flesh and bone, and his face is barely recognizable. Attached to the man's legs are several short ropes, frayed and knotted, stretching upward and still tethered to the bridge above. The stunned and horrified man, with trembling hands, backs away from the gruesome sight and quickly calls the Fairfax County Police. They waste no time, arriving at the scene promptly, and soon after, a wide-scale investigation is launched, revealing some truly strange and disturbing details. The victim was identified as 22-year-old fast food worker Eric Garcia, and the ropes wrapped tightly around his lifeless body were bungee cords, apparently from a poorly conceived stunt that had gone terribly wrong. However, the events that led to this tragic outcome were far more strange than anyone could have imagined. The night before, on Saturday, after finishing his shift at the local fast food joint, Eric finally decided it was his time to pull off the thrill ride he'd been obsessing over for so long. Bungee jumping had always been on the top of his list, and for weeks, he'd been trying to find the perfect spot to make it happen. Unfortunately, there weren't any professional jumping stations nearby, and he couldn't justify the travel expenses just for this one activity. So being the determined 22-year-old he was, Eric decided to go for it all by himself. Interestingly, to undertake this disturbing stunt, he came out with a pretty meticulous approach. For days, he kept on researching the cords and safety belts, while also going through some instructional guides, piecing together tips on how to safely pull off a jump without having access to the proper equipment. Once he had that figured out, the next step was picking the right spot. It had to be high up and sturdy enough to secure his cords before the freefall. Thinking of it, the only place that met these criteria was the railway bridge over Lake Hainbach Park. It offered a 70-foot drop and had rails that seemed perfect for anchoring his setup, so after finishing his usual routine on the weekend of July 12th, Eric gathered all his makeshift gear and headed to the railway bridge. From there, he had a clear view of the park's concrete pavement far below. He tied several cords to the railway tracks, checking and rechecking each knot to make sure it was secure. Then, for the final touch, he wrapped the other ends of the cords tightly around his waist, and instead of using buckles, reinforced them with duct tape. Despite how questionable that choice was, his plan looked solid on paper, at least to him, although in reality, it was a huge miscalculation. During his preparation, Eric missed a simple yet crucial detail. Bungee cords stretch during a jump. For example, if a person jumps off a bridge, the cords stretch and pull them back up before they reach the very bottom of the fall. This means the cords need to be shorter than the total fall distance to account for the stretch. Eric, however, prepared his bungee cord to the exact length of the fall. This meant there was no extra room for a stretch, and he would end up falling directly onto the pavement, head first, without any rebound or safety. But unaware of this fatal oversight, he gave the knots and duct tape one final check, and then leaped off the tracks, and seconds later, he would find himself crashing into the concrete ground with such brutal impact that it killed him instantly. The next couple of hours, his lifeless body would lie there until the darkness of night passed. It was only then that the local resident came across the scene and called the cops, but by that time, it was already too late, and Eric had paid the ultimate price for his unnecessary adventure. October 1st, 1995. Tens of thousands of onlookers are gathered along the banks of Niagara River for an extraordinary spectacle. 39-year-old Robert Overacker is about to ride a jet ski off the edge of Horseshoe Falls, equipped with a rocket-powered parachute. Several cameras are capturing this hair-raising stunt as he enters the river near the Canadian Niagara power plant and races headlong towards the falls. Among the crowd are his family and friends, all cheering him on and hoping for the best. The plan is to plunge over the 51-meter or 167-foot drop on the jet ski, deploy the parachute, and touch down safely in the icy waters below before swimming to shore. For what he hopes to achieve, the goal is to draw as much attention as possible to raise awareness for the plight of homeless people. But moments later, tragedy struck. Born on the 4th of July in 1956 in Santa Monica, California, Robert Overacker grew up with the Pacific Ocean as his backdrop. From a young age, he was drawn to nature and the thrill of pushing his limits. Throughout his growing years, he mastered a lot of acrobatic and athletic skills, honing his talents and igniting his interest in extreme sports. However, it initially didn't seem to be a suitable profession to make a good living, so he ended up bouncing between several jobs, none of which could fit his free-roaming spirit he had. Then, during his teenage years, he fell in love with another cause that changed his life. Throughout his childhood in California, he saw the struggles of homeless people up close. For a bit of context, California has the highest percentage of homeless individuals in the US even today. There are over 180,000 people without any proper housing. While these numbers continue to rise every year back in the 1960s and 70s, it wasn't any less of an issue. Robert, who was close to nature, became passionate about helping his community. He realized he could leverage his love for extreme sports to shine a spotlight on the issue, so he started doing shows and public displays to support this cause. Though he did manage to grab some attention, it wasn't the big change he'd hoped for. Still, he kept at it, waiting for the perfect opportunity to make a greater impact. When he turned 32, he came up with this deadly plan of falling through Niagara Falls on a jet ski. It was hands down his most daring stunt yet, and the potential rewards were equally massive. If he pulled it off, he'd grab a ton of spotlight, which would help him gather the resources he needed to back his cause. The responsibility was huge, and he wanted to make sure he was fully ready. So for the next 7 years, he spent his time planning and prepping for it, even though his friends and family were continuously trying to prevent him from doing it. A couple of times, he got really close to going through with it, but kept pushing it off because of their constant disapproval. As one of the most dangerous in the world, Niagara's Horseshoe Falls dropped 51 meters or 167 feet with insane force, creating unpredictable currents at the bottom. On top of the freezing waters, jet skiing down those falls meant not only dealing with the height and impact, but also the sheer power of the river, which could make the control nearly impossible. Even with a parachute, the brutal winds could mess with deployment, making it too risky to avoid crashing into the rocky base or getting swept into lethal whirlpools. While he couldn't do much to eliminate all the risks, over the years he had come up with an idea to use a rocket-propelled parachute, also known as a ballistic chute, instead of the regular kind. These types of parachutes are used when you're close to the ground, or when the air is so unpredictable that a standard parachute might take too long to fully deploy, so the rocket propulsion attached to it helps the parachute open instantly, cutting down on the risk big time. With enough on-paper planning, Robert finally decided to go for the daring attempt in late 2001. On October 1st, he was joined by his family and a crowd of several onlookers gathered at Niagara Falls, as well as on the rooftops of neighboring buildings and restaurants, all of whom had their cameras ready to record him completing the leap. At 12:35 p.m., Robert entered the Canadian Horseshoe Falls and began jet skiing towards the edge, picking up speed fast. In just moments, he reached the drop-off, letting go of the ski as he plunged into the 51-meter fall. He went to deploy the rocket-propelled parachute strapped to his back, but unfortunately, the unexpected occurred. The crowd watched in horror as he plummeted straight into the white churning waters below, completely consumed by the massive waterfall. His parachute never opened. It turns out at the very last moment, he hadn't packed it properly, and worse, it wasn't even securely attached to him. As the water swallowed him, he vanished from sight, leaving everyone on edge. After several minutes, his body resurfaced, being tossed around by the powerful waves. At first, people thought he might still be alive because the strong currents made it look like he was swimming, but it quickly became clear that his body was just being thrown around by the force of the water, completely lifeless. 2 days later, authorities recovered his body, and he was officially pronounced dead at the nearby hospital. The cause of death was drowning since his body had no broken bones, meaning he didn't hit the rocks, and if that parachute had worked, he might have actually made it out alive. The American Sprint Car Series, also known as ASCS, is one of the most electrifying racing spectacles in the United States, featuring high-powered, open-wheel vehicles engineered for short-track battles that push the limits of speed and control. With tight turns and hard-stopping finishes on dirt or paved ovals, this high-octane sport demands a relentless go-for-broke mindset where drivers willingly hurl themselves into extremely high-risk endeavors, chasing victory at high speeds. As long as it's confined to the track, that attitude is safe enough, but sometimes it can go off the rails into recklessness, setting the stage for catastrophe and entirely avoidable disasters. The 2003 ASCS National Champion settled in the Dallas area town of Forney, Texas. Travis Rylat was running a car interior business with his wife, Mariana, by 2010. After earning his title, the couple had moved to Forney when their parents, Dorothy and Greg, closed up their longtime bait and tackle shop on the Texas City Dike. The shop had been a local resource for fishermen for years, but Hurricane Ike wiped it out in 2008. Losing the family business was tough, but Travis wasn't the type to stay down. He bounced back, starting his own venture while still keeping his racing career alive, and it wasn't long before he found success in both. That's also when he met Tyson Perez, a crazy fellow with the same drive. Travis brought him on as a crew chief and got him selling exotic race car parts at the shop. Hailing from Australia, Perez brought a unique flair to the job. As the crew chief, he was the brains behind Travis's race car strategies and car setups, while also being a go-to resource on the sales floor. The duo clicked well and everything was going pretty smoothly until mid-2010, when Travis got an invite to a series of races in Washington. They wasted no time heading over, ready to hit the ground. But what awaited them was far beyond anything they'd imagined. During their preparations round, one random evening on July 18th of 2010, after wrapping up work on their car at the workshop, they came up with a wild idea. What would happen if they rode a barrel of fire like a rocket? The answer must have been more intriguing than the question, and they couldn't resist finding that out. So they decided they would pick up an empty 55-gallon barrel, rig it up to fire from behind while they sat on it, and take a thrilling ride, expecting it to zoom down the parking lot rapidly like a rocket. In hindsight, this was an attempt at suicide, especially with their decision to fill the barrel with 4 gallons of methanol to spark the fire. They were basically setting up a bomb. But their adventure-seeking minds didn't quite grasp the danger at the time. So sticking to their unsettling plan, they filled the barrel, took a seat on it, and lit it. But instead of the anticipated excitement, all they heard was a loud whoosh, followed by a massive explosion. The blast was so intense that one end of the barrel was flung 37 meters, or 120 feet away, leaving the men severely burned. After a few hours, the parking lot was swarming with paramedics and firefighters, and when they were rushed to the hospital, both were still conscious. Medical teams assessed their injuries as third-degree burns covering up to 62% of their bodies, with damage reaching down to fat, muscle, and even bone in some places. The duo was airlifted to Harborview Medical Center in Seattle for advanced care. That worked well for Travis as he began to show signs of recovery, but Tyson couldn't handle the excruciating pain and agony and succumbed to death 2 days later. Following the disturbing event, several sponsors from the racing community came forward and set up funds to support Travis in managing the lengthy medical bills. After a years-long recovery, he made his comeback on the racetrack in 2018, picking up right where he left off. During midnight of Friday on February 1st of 2008, a couple of friends on holiday at a ski resort are having a blast together. They've been here with a larger group, and it's been a fun-filled adventure so far. The resort is nestled in Saus-d'Ol, a charming little town in the metropolitan city of Turin in northern Italy, near the French border. It's one of 6 villages that make up the Via Lattea, or Milky Way, a region known for being one of the largest ski playgrounds in Europe. It offers over 400 kilometers, or 250 miles of terrain, with 140 interconnected slopes and 92 lifts that reach heights from 1,300 to 2,800 meters. Catering to skiers of all levels amid stunning alpine backdrops. An amusing nonsense talk beneath a ski slope end, a certain skier, a 46-year-old British guy named David Monk, who may have had a bit too much fun as well as alcohol, came up with the idea of skiing across a giant slope. While it was nighttime and visibility was near zero, this wasn't the only thing wild about it. The intoxicated group realized they didn't have a sled or anything even close to being suitable for the job, so they figured it was a good time to set up a makeshift solution. There would usually be a couple of staff around to keep things in check. It was midnight, so the place was totally empty. Taking advantage of the situation, they ripped a few foam pads off the railing and hauled them up the mountain, hiking in pitch black darkness. It took them a while, and by the time they reached the top, the early morning light had just started to break through, but that didn't make their scheme any less dangerous. The makeshift sleds they'd created now seemed like a bigger problem than the darkness ever was. Plus, they had stripped a big chunk of protective padding right from the center of the railing, so if they reached the end of the slope, they'd be crashing straight into the metal fence. The rush of excitement and their foggy thoughts totally drowned out any sense of impending danger. The only thing that could have saved them would have been if their makeshift sleds had somehow slowed down due to resistance or friction, giving them a chance to stop midway, but that never happened. David and the group launched themselves down the slope in their mattress sleds, and within minutes, they were hurling down the hill at terrifying speeds. The rubber pads proved to be as easy to slide as a sled, However, neither they could control it nor was there any protection waiting at the end of the slope. A group of people now appearing on the scene watched them barreling down the hill, cheering and shouting excitedly, and then the inevitable happened. David, leading the group down the slope, slammed right into the same spot he'd swiped the padding from. The impact was catastrophic. His head and ribs collided with the metal railing, resulting in several broken bones and punctured internal organs, and he died instantly. Meanwhile, the rest of the group, trailing behind, also went tumbling into the same gap and sustained severe injuries, but managed to survive the event. People watching the chaos rushed over as soon as they saw the group piling into the fence one after another. By the time they arrived, David was already out cold. They did everything they could to help and called for assistance, and the medical team arrived quickly and performed chest compressions on him, but unfortunately, he never woke up.